And but yeah, we you have to go out there. Yeah, let's see.
Right. All of this is correct. See,
Yeah.
yes, now.
Really imagine you are the Indian man being caught by the police. And me was the one catching. I'll be glad you caught by now. It's not a sexy song. Like you get caught by a police officer that looks like me sad now.
I can start in 3, 2, 1. So there are first few pieces of framing, right? So firstly, what does a string operation possibly look like? String operation is highly speculative and is probably mostly done in high prosperity crime areas, right? Because this string operation is a large scale operation which is probably not targeting one individual, but probably the masses or like those neighborhoods have the more proximal to where the crime is committed, right? And why is this like simply bad? But before I go through these nuances, for my second pieces of framing is what does this simply look like, right? How does a string operation actually operate, and how does this look like? First, the police will sort of like act like one of the people within these neighborhoods, and for sort of like impersonate and like convince sort of impersonate one of the people within these neighborhoods, and probably one convince these people who's like high proximity to do this crime to actually commit the crime, or B, probably like wait until like this person is probably committing the crime, right? But let me tell you why the first is going to happen compared to the later, where these polices have much more of an incentive to probably convince the people who have the proximity to do crime to actually commit the crime, right? Because one is because of the reasons of how the string operation is actually gonna like happen, because now the police have much more of an incentive because they are allocated resources that have a necessary KPI to achieve. Like that means that this operation wouldn't have viable outcomes if there are not necessary people who are like probably accused of or reprimanded at the end of the day, right? And why is it like necessarily bad? Because then you're probably like convincing, like even if they were like potential criminals, you're convincing victims of the situation or the victims itself to like probably commit these type of crimes, right? And in this narrative also police have much of an incentive to probably like force these people, like convince these people to act on the crime itself, even if they are probably like won't do so if they are not put in the situation, is because the police want to be perceived as a good actor, right? Because one of the reasons that they have a high necessity to do so is because they do not want to receive public scrutiny or media outcry, right? And second, like fourthly, what are the check and balances that within the status quo, which is probably like not like very much helpful and increases the necessity towards a ban, right? Because status quo might need probably some amount of check and balances, like probably viable evidences or like discretion process. But we tell you here on the side government how these processes are something that is probably overlooked by the police itself. And I've already like stated the characterization how this like a individual from the police force has the much more of an incentive to probably like desatisfy most of these check and balances, because they're probably going to be like, oh, like they have to act as good actors, or they probably have a necessary like there's a probably have to have some amount of tangible outcomes out of this operation. So they're probably set up to like a failure where they probably like convince like possible victims of situation, right? Because often cases these string operations, like I've told you, is happened in those of or those neighborhoods which are probably like proximal to crime, right? Because these neighborhoods are often cases like neighborhoods which have like high socioeconomic problem, a cycle of poverty, and a cycle of like a lot of like addiction or a lot of problems, right? Because you cannot tell me that how people would simply commit the crime for the sake of commit the crime, because you have the person is probably going to commit the crime if they are because it's committing is crime is probably something which is risk adverse, therefore they have some reason to do so, and the only possible like proximal reason is probably how they are entrapped in a cycle of like poverty or in a cycle of a socio-economic problem, right? And this brings to my first form of argument why the harms necessitate a probable ban. I've already talked to you about how most of the check and balances in status quo probably fails, and therefore this is necessary a ban, right? Because most of the alternative has been exhausted, and the check and balances probably won't work out, and it's almost difficult to determine if the person will commit a crime. Like I've already stated all of the examples and all of the characterization in the earlier part of the debate as to why is this reason. The problem is not the fact that this person is probably proximal to crime, right? The problem is much more deeper, because this is a structural problem that you have to simply look upon, right? Because you can't prove that this person has the intent to do so. I mean, like maybe if this police didn't convince the person is possible wouldn't commit the crime. And even if you want to say this person does commit a crime, you have to understand it's much more of a structural problem, and it's not a problem of persecuting this person itself. And often cases, what is violates, right? It violates the social contract, because the social contract is such that the state has the obligation to probably like protect its citizens, right? And the state have to prevent the harm, prevent the harm on the citizen itself. And if the state, for example, the state's actors, which is the police itself, actively have the incentive to like convince these people to probably commit the crime, that's simply bad, right? Because this is violating the principle of the social contract, right? And the state is probably playing a big part in doing this harm, right? The state assumes you're going to do a harm, therefore puts the possible repercussions on you and forces the possible repercussions on you, because that is simply bad, right? And often cases, these are victims of state failures and victims of circumstances, because I already told you where these like string operations are probably going to set upon, like these types of neighborhood, which is simply set those victims for like, up failure. And how does this counterfactual look like, right? We have to wait, we have to at least on our side of the one other side government, we're probably waiting for this person to actually commit the crime, or we're probably focusing on the bigger structural socioeconomic issues, right? This seems like rehabilitation process for the vast majority of people and focusing on the community itself. The effect is clear. People who do nothing to violate the social contract should not be infringed upon the crimes they possibly violate or possibly do upon. And for all of these reasons, proud to
Me, Sunway. Uh,
next week.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Minister's framing is totally wrong here, because in this debate we are debating about what is sting operate, whether it should ban sting operations or not, but not how we are going to we are going to be using it to convict them. So now look at this. So they are always talking about the potential abuse of powers, but this debate does not completely cover it, because no matter it's symmetrical on both sides, abuse of power will ever happen in the bad government. Even if a bad government comes about, even though you ban sting operations, the bad government will always find a way to oppress their victims, to oppress the people. By banning it, there is no way you can say on your side that the bad government will use other sorts of power to actually convict who they want to go into prison, or people who are what you say in poverty or in drug influenced communities. So let me try to reframe the entire debate here. So what is sting operation? We all know, I think what I agree with Prime Minister, sting operation is usually a very complex operation. It takes a lot of money, people, and a lot of planning. So definitely the police or other organizations will not use it for the poorest people, for the people who are in protest, for people in other terms. So it's such complicated. So why is such hold on a minute. So what are the government going to use for the sting operations? They're usually going to target the people at the top. They're trying to break up drug cartels. They're trying to break up corporate mafias. They're trying to solve corporate espionage cases. So this is where we can actually catch. For example, we know all those Panama papers, all these were all discovered because of sting operations. Without sting operations, there will be no Panama papers. There will be no Peru papers. There will be no all these exposees that exposes the people at the top committing big crimes. So, as what I want to argue about, Prime Minister saying about there's no checks and balances, but then we need to know. In sting operations, there are check and balances. You're not allowed to manufacture an environment to create crime because this will be encroachment, entrapment. You are constantly you are only there to actually observe or partake. You're actually not allowed to conspire. Yes, you can actually partake in illegal activities, but you're not allowed to aspire with let's say I'm a police officer undercover in the drug organization. I say, I'm going to plan to ship drugs to Cuba, but I can't do that because I am still a sworn officer of the law. So I will not. Let's say my boss asks me to take drugs. Okay, I have to do that, but I'm not allowed to be the planner in this regard. So now let's before I talk about arguments, sure, I can take a POI.
I think a lot of the problems that you see, it's like it's different from what we've. I think it's because of selective bias, right? These police officers are probably. We're not telling that these government are simply bad. What we're telling is that these police are probably set up for failure because their incentive is probably different when they are probably in like.
So, okay, I think I get what you are meaning. But the thing is, we already have efficient check and balances for this system because we have a hierarchy of this. And then what you assume is the same thing. We need, you assume it's the same thing. There will be, the check and balances that that we need to assume because this is symmetrical. No matter what, bad police officers will always occur. No matter the policy. So if you ban sting operations, bad police officers always have various other methods to actually oppress the people, such as just barging into your house or something like that. That's the same thing. So it's symmetrical on both sides of houses. So now let me enter into my argument here. Criminal organizations are complicated organizations, so they require extrajudicial practices in order to obtain evidence. As we know, these criminal organizations such as drug cartels, such as corporate mafias, they have a deep entrenched system around them. They have big lobbying power. They have big influence, not to charge them, not to actually investigate them. But these sting operations operate on a low profile. They allow the police officers to actually go in to actually investigate, to actually gather enough evidence, to actually get enough evidence to actually prosecute them with a high percentage chance. How does this look like? This is the corporate mafia scandal that we're handling right now in Malaysia, where we're actually gathering evidence to actually prosecute the people who are in power and the people who are actually in close proximity to the people on top. So what does this look like? By catching, because this also goes to the second layer. We are not going after the small people, as we call it my framing. We're not going for people with petty theft, the people who are selling, the people who are smuggling, the drug mules, the people who are on the ground, the small people. No, we are going for the big fish, the big people here, the people who are on the top, people making decisions, people who are conspiring to topple governments, the people conspiring to influence our people. These are the people that we are going off at, because without these sting operations, we cannot get into close proximity to this issue. As we know, like in the corporate mafia incident, we don't know who's at the top, who's the guy who's actually influencing and actually playing all the strings. So by having all this what we call spies in these organizations, we are able to identify network, relation, and actually pinpoint who is in charge, who is actually in charge of all these policies, who do we need to arrest, and who that we can actually take down the entire organization together. So now let's look at. So this is about how we allow for us to actually go with a high success rate to ensure that the police, yes, you can say, I think what Farina just said about KPIs, yes, to some extent, but the KPIs here is that simple. We already know these people are known criminals. We are only going to use this policy for the known criminals at the very top, because you know the high risk expense ratio, the high amount of transparency needed. And we need to look at a clause here. We need to actually prosecute these people to ensure that our community, our nation will remain safe. And I would and you can go back to the transparency and the checks and balances about Perina saying there's not enough check and balances because they are going for KPIs. Right? But the KPI is part of a thing that is saying, hey, we need transparent reporting. The agent, I mean the spy, the police officer needs to actually send a frequent report to its supervisor. So I don't get the sense of how this frequent report will actually help to I would say destroy this KPI argument and actually no, sorry this KPI will actually influence them to actually create a situation where people will actually make more crime. Instead, they are just reporting the findings they are doing. And this report is important to ensure that the agent does not go rogue, because we know rogue agents do tend to have this is something that we will take the bullet for. But we need to establish that this rogue agents is not part of the debate. The debate here is whether we should ban sting operations or not. And this house would oppose this such motion. Thank you.
3 questions to answer in this speech. The first is, where are sting operations used? Judge, first exchange has a clash on where sting exchanges are going to be applied. Op says that it's going to be big actors and mafia bosses. We say that it's going to be the small actor. Presumably, both these frames can coexist in the round, because it's probable that police want to fulfill their KPIs, and it is also probable that police want to catch big mafia actors. I don't think that this is necessarily something that clashes. I think it coexists. Why then, regardless of where it is used, does the problem still exist? Firstly, because for every big mafia actor that you use sting operations on, there is also a small actor that you use it on for the reasons that we give you. Maybe Jason is right. You want to catch the people that are committing the biggest crimes and you have insufficient evidence. But it is equally right that it is easier to catch low socioeconomic people who lack legal representation and the access to this, and therefore it means that when you want to fulfill KPIs and the number of callers that you have in a year, for example, this is a much easier pathway to get there. Crucially, the way you weigh why this is important if police incentive is somewhat symmetric on both sides is because it is much easier both in terms of time and effort to do it towards the people on our side than it is on theirs. Fundamentally, this means that while you are doing one big sting operation on Al Pacino or something like that, oh wait, that's an actor, it also means that it also probably means that you are doing multiple sting operations on small actors in the first place. The second way to view this then is to view whether alternatives exist that don't leave the subset of the population harmed. We tell you that it does. Why? Firstly, what do these alternatives look like? These alternatives look like ones that are heavily tied towards the types of crimes being committed. So with things like the mafia, which is smuggling drugs, for example, there is usually a paper trail of the drugs being smuggled. If it is people that are bribing individuals, for example, financial audits usually are the ways that you do this. The second thing then is on why this is fundamentally better. The first is that this process is usually ones that are much more airtight in the ways that the investigation is done. You track paper trails and follow through very, very intricately. Secondly, because it means that things like entrapment, which are very, very easy to contend with if you have a good lawyer, don't become reasons to throw these cases out of court. Tells you that low-class individuals can't prove entrapment because of the fact that they lack legal representation. If you flip this logic onto op, because exactly mafia and other rich individuals have access to this, it's much easier to prove entrapment in the first place. Why? Firstly, because it's very difficult to prove the grey area of intent. The police will say, you intended to commit this crime and I was simply there to help you do it. A good lawyer will obviously say, no, you coerced my client. You came and gave him something that had zero risk of transfer and a very high probability of reward. This is exactly how lawyers are going to argue this in the first place. Crucially, on both sides, maybe there's a probabilistic chance that a mafia boss gets caught and charged with something. It is on our side where the probability of finding them guilty, if you don't use sting operations, is going to be much higher in the round. What we need to judge by the end of this response, that a majority of sting operations that end up in jail are going to be the ones that we contend, because we are structurally much more likely to end up in jail than the big actors on their side. The harms therefore materialize much more on op, and the benefit that they're able to claim from this advantage is much less than they would like to claim. The second reason why this is something that is, the second question I want to answer then is whether this is a good use of resource, and it's also something that is something that constitutes a ban. So the way we evaluate whether what constitutes a ban is whether there is the existence of alternatives towards doing this. Pravina gives you a laundry list of reasons as to why these alternatives exist. But I want to weigh these alternatives in the round. The reason that these alternatives are better for the subset that we talk about firstly is because these alternatives focus on addressing the root causes of issues. It focuses on uplifting the socio-economic conditions of the people that are poor and the people that are severely marginalized. Secondly, you ought to weigh this very well, both principally and practically. Principally, because these are the people most failed by the state and therefore should be remunerated by the state in getting these things in the first place. But the second is because it's much more principally consistent with the social contract. If I consent to live in a state, it is completely unfair that the state gets to say, I think you are going to commit a crime. I am now going to put you through a series of events that very likely leads you into committing a crime. That suspicion is a violation of the social contract, and that is why you should weigh it very heavily in the round. But crucially, I want to answer the practical question of sufficiency. Why is it sufficient? Firstly, most of the people that are involved in sting operations, regardless of what the police and CIA tell you, were likely never going to commit the crime that people think that they would in the first place. This doesn't apply to mafia bosses. This applies to the people on the ground in black communities who get caught by crack cocaine operations throughout the USA's history. The reason why is firstly because even if police can't entrap you, they oftentimes present it very different to a regular drug dealer. So when meeting a drug dealer oftentimes comes with a lot of risk entailed. You need to meet them behind a shady park, for example. You don't usually have this with a Fed. Secondly, feds oftentimes use a lot of language that operate within the legal gray area. And the premise from this is the asymmetry that exists between the individual that is interacting with the police, who has very little legal knowledge, versus the individual who is enticing you in the first place. Crucially, this means that because it is difficult to prove entrapment or not entrapment, and this usually depends on a good legal team, it is much more averse towards the poorest individuals. Is there a POI? No. Therefore, the reason why sufficiency exists as a practical consideration is one, because of the practical harms which you need to weigh heavily in the round. Even if Gov can't provide you an alternative that is as good for sting operations in some instances of the round, we tell you that the weighing here is we much rather 10 guilty men walk free than one innocent man be put in jail, because simply that innocent man's right to liberty matters more than the state being retributive in nature. The last question I want to answer then is on the allocation of resources and where it is better for you. This team says that resources are presumably well allocated, but this is premised on the idea that, well, you as a person only know how to catch people through sting operations. I've already explained why this isn't true. Why is the expenditure of resource on our side much better? Firstly, because this expenditure of resource isn't tied towards diminishing or taking away the right of another person. So crucially, on both sides, we might believe that this is a high crime area. On our side, you do things like give them rehabilitative justice. You do things like go there and give them seminars and help them get away from drug-related offenses in the first place. If a crime might happen on both sides, the reaction of the state is much better on our side. This is an additional reason why we're in the round.
First thing I want to get out of the way is this idea that sting operations are used and can be coexistingly used for small time criminals, which is materially all the harms they're talking about, and also big time people that we're talking about. Vignesh says that you can do both, but the harms in the demographic that we're talking about significantly outweigh the potential benefits you can get for the people we're talking about. Therefore, we win the debate. I don't think that's the right way to approach this question. First thing we must ask is something that he also concedes. This is something that will require resource. In order to train officers to be undercover agents, in order to ensure that there's enough infrastructure so that they can successfully execute a sting operation, because these type of things takes months, in some instances years, means that every time you decide to go to a sting operation, it has to incur a massive amount of cost. And you're doing this only if the payoff is great. So this is how we beat their versions of all sting operations. Because sure, there can be bad governments, there can be officers that just want to see black people go to jail and they're tired of finding them at the corners of high crime areas. They want to do these things, but they're limited by the people at the top who determines whether a sting operation is done or not. It's not the racist police officers that determine this. It's the people at the top who have other considerations to care about. There are politicians to answer to, governments to answer to, states to answer to, ensuring that they can achieve results as a result of executing a really expensive policy on public taxpayer dollars. So given all these considerations, I think it is more likely that sting operations will be used in the specific instances that we're talking about. But nevertheless, we'll bite the bullet and say it can happen in the circumstances you're talking about as well, but we will just say that's not enough to justify a ban. Second, Vignesh then tells you, how do we justify this ban? Because alternatives exist. What are his alternatives? The paper trail that drug dealers do. Here's my problem. A lot of drug dealers, they do their business in cash. So there's no paper trail. That's number one. Number two, even if they have a large paper trail, it's protected with extremely dubious accounting systems. Either they funnel it through banks that have no reason to be cooperative with police authorities. So you go there, you tell them, we think Pablo Escobar is using your bank. Can you please give us a paper trail so that we can use it against him, because he's killing children, he's harming our people. You do know what the bank will tell you? He's a very important client to us. If you want something, get a court order. You go to court, court will tell you, you want to go against the bank and get his records? You need to first show fraud. How do I show fraud? I need the documents. I can't get the documents until I establish fraud. Can't establish fraud without the documents. What am I going to do? I'm stuck in this situation. The best way I can do is I need to be part of this circle, identify it, and get this paper from another source and then use it against this person. From there, I can proceed with my large investigation powers and purposes and so on from there. The best case scenario from here is we get all the things that you're talking about and use it effectively. The worst case scenario here is we get nothing. Even then, we get information. Like what Jason says, sometimes you don't even know who the big players are in these situations. Sting operations fail, but yet information is gathered for the next thing that we can do. Before that, last thing I want to contend with is that Vignesh says this will be ammo for all the great lawyers to say, aha, entrapment happened. The lines are blurred. Again, I concede, in certain specific scenarios, the lines is going to be blurred. Whether or not a police officer manufactured a situation where the crime could have occurred, and this may result in a poor opportunity to prosecute in the future. That is fair. But first of all, this will happen in a very narrow version of circumstance. Generally speaking, it can be quite clear if you caught someone in the act or you manufactured the situation so that this person can be caught in the act. Generally speaking, I think it's easy to distinctify between one and the other, no matter how great a lawyer you are. But secondly, and more importantly, it's better to have something. If I have nothing and I'm going after Pablo Escobar, his lawyer will have a field day. That would be excellent. So I would rather have something that is difficult to defend versus having nothing and still trying to catch this person and put him in jail. But before I continue, yes, your question. Okay, no worries. Now, let's talk about infringement of rights. Again, this operates on a premise that these criminals needs their rights protected. I don't think so. In large general scenarios, you can lie to a criminal, to a potential criminal while you are in interrogation. You have broad limits that what you can do in instances to ensure if a life is considered or if you're protecting society. That is what police authorities have. Yes, limitations are there, but generally speaking, it's much looser when we're talking about solving the issue of crime. So I think all this issue of rights and is just a wash, because rights are not the issue in this debate. The issue here is whether or not sting operations are effective, successful in solving a problem. We tell you it is, it shouldn't be banned. That's all. Second thing is this idea of KPI. Again, like I said, even if it is true, KPI is an issue, these people are not making the decisions. Even if people have sting operations, the target isn't, I want you boys to go out there, find all the drug dealers, whoever you can, catch them in this sting operation. But if you miss out on the big dude, it's fine, because what I want is numbers. That's not the goal. Every goal of a sting operation is targeted. This is our target, or at the very least, this is what I want to know as a result of this sting operation. That's what you're building towards. You won't do anything to jeopardize that. So if you're going to catch a low guy because you've caught him doing a crime while the sting operation is undergoing, but because you're jeopardizing the whole operation. Is it worth it? Generally, we tell you a police officer will make this calculated decision and say, fuck that shit, I'm not doing it. But yes, question.
But if it's as costly as you claim, and the probability of being thrown out in court is as high as, or likely, somewhat likely as you claim, then isn't it already something that police...
First of all, I never said it was likely. I'm admitting and conceding to a point that you have said, which is that lines can be blurred. I'm defending against it. That's what I think a good debater should do. I'm not conceding anything. I'm just giving you a response to a bullshit argument. But never mind. Now, going into what happens when there is no sting operations. The first thing I want to say is this will change the approach of investigation. Now, everyone knows that no matter what, there's no way to circumvent due process. All the top criminals who have great lawyers, who have beaten the system for decades, know that the one thing against them is a successful sting operation. In fact, they dedicate a lot of time and resources in order to uncover undercover operations in their criminal organizations, because they know this is what can hurt them. You take that away now. First things first is, in order to prosecute all these people, it has to be a cautious, slow game. The impact of this is that crime will go on forever, and it's incredibly hard to beat it. I mean, generally crime will go on forever, but I think we slow it down much better in a world where you have sting operations. Second is, you embolden all these criminals because they know all they need to do, because you are locked by the rules of due process and being an ethical, authoritative figure in order to prosecute a crime. They are not locked by these same rules. Knowing that now you cannot change the rules is going to embolden them even further, and this will cause all of these impacts. That's why I tell you, even if it means sometimes we catch a person and we entrap him because the lines are blurred, I will happily send one guilty person to jail if it means 10 innocent people can be happy. For those reasons.
The first call out I want to make is just a question on ethicalness, because I want to really clearly here say that all of the checks and balances that exist or are appointed to you when you're assigned to be a person that has to uncover something from a sting operation aren't designed to be protectionary towards the people that you have to perpetrate. It's designed to be protectionist towards your end goal of extracting something from this sting operation. But the second thing I want to call out then is just, if both sides already agree here that particularly when we try to entrap people, or we want to extract specific types of information and they have to be done through very unethical methods, then I don't think there's a clear enough justification coming from up here saying why sting operations are the best methods for us to be procuring this information. I'm going to explain here later why it still manifests better underneath this GOP comparative. The first question I want to ask that is, how effective then is this approach of speculativeness when we choose to implement sting operations in these different areas? What does OP tell you here? They say that first, sting operations are very unlikely to be abused because it's just not going to happen. They say the checks and balances exist. That's overall why it's something that's effective and very needed within these circumstances. The first thing I want to point out here is to analyze the types of crime that we intend to dismantle when we implement sting operations in the first place. And to know that these crimes are inherently things that are very, very systemic. Because what are the evaluation processes employed when sting operations happen in the first place? It's things like we just evaluate whether or not this person is proximate towards this type of crime? Are these areas that are places that have high propensity of criminal activity happening in the first place? What do we tell you then on why structurally evaluating it via this method is things that are very, very harmful? The first is just generally it's a violation of the state contract imposed onto people who have these authoritarian like evaluations onto you rather to you as a like citizen. Because what is the logic here that these police operate on when you do your sting operations? It's always entry with the intention of extracting and finding particular harm in those particular areas and within these particular groups. We explained to you then there's different police incentives when you enter sting operations in the first place. Because at the point in which you prove towards your like, I don't know, your police captain or towards society in general that a sting operation has been successful, this is when the benefits then are things that are tenfold, like not onto your perpetrators or not onto the communities that you've extracted that crime onto, but rather onto your police force itself. This is when, like when you hit that quota, then this is when you get larger budgets being allocated towards your police force. This is when you have larger state benefits being particularly allocated towards you then. And the second thing I want to point out here again is that the checks and balances that act as the like protectionary methods, or like sorry, that acts as the methods here that they say aren't going to likely to be abused by your police societies, then are again they aren't designed to be protectionary towards peoples in societies in the first place. There's three reasons why this happens. The first is take a look at just generally, do the police have a very large amount of leverage that you're implementing towards these people, not just after you've like caught them in the act in the first place, but when you're trying to induce them and trying to extract some particularly kind of reaction to get the main thing that you want them to like provide to you in the first place. But the second reason why this is very harmful onto these different like dynamics that we're establishing between your police and between your people in the first place is that again, likely then these people don't have these access to the different kind of legal protections anyway. So it's very hard for you then when you're being placed in court to actually prove whether or not you had the intention to do these things or not. I'm going to explain this later, why particularly this dynamic is very, very harmful. And I think Gov explicitly explains to you why, again, it's not likely going to be like the interactions between your big boss mafia. It's likely, again, your people on the lower rings of the ladder here. But the third thing I want you to take away from the speculativeness of entering or like why sting operation should be implemented in the first place is to really weigh your like police incentives when you want to place these things in the first place. Because in so far that we tell you already, there's a long list of things that are going to be like manifesting on the adverse of you just proving that some level of successfulness was extracted from this sting operation. Your cops aren't going to care if you get the end goal of your big boss mafia. I think Ram says this also, it's not really like, well, you need to prove that you caught the big guy. Even if they get some small scapegoat to prove that, yes, this amount of allocation of resources was justifiable enough for us to pour and have this sting operation in the first place, that is how the police calculus works here. It's not necessarily going to unlock the benefits that that opposition says here. The second thing I want to analyze here is the sufficiency in dismantling wide-scale crime, which is why like ops says is very, very successful. They frame here, these are things like your cartels and your mafias, things that are very, very like intrinsically hard to analyze. The question that op here doesn't particularly analyze very well is how do these organizations operate anyway? That they can say, yes, your intention by setting up this sting operation in the first place is to take down your big boss, your Al Pacino or whatever, but not the people who are doing the bulk of identifiable crime that you can actively track within society. It's the people who are at the lower rung of these ladders. These are the people who are like pushing drugs on the ground. These are the people that are like recruiting your members into your gangs. These are the people who are actively expanding these cartels and organizations in the first place. And exactly what Gov explains here to you coming out from Perth, these are the people with the highest propensity then to be targeted by your cops anyways. This is where we explain to you that the worst harms are going to manifest out of coming out from up here anyway. I don't necessarily there's a clear delineation here why particularly all these magical capturings of your big boss mafia is going to happen, given that it's much more likely your police is going to have the incentive to capture whoever is most beneficial towards them. Is there anything?
The goal isn't to catch every big mafia. The goal is to give ourselves the best chance. Don't you think that happens in a world where sting operations?
Yeah, again, but the best chance you're referring to is always extracting some kind of thing to justify the sting operation happening in the first place. I think in so far that Gov tells you already, the people who are most likely going to be put in that position of facing perpetration in the first place is going to be the people on your lower rung of the ladder. I think this is quite a clear clash we're giving to Gov here. The second thing I want to talk about then is what are the logical frameworks that like your sting operations exist on in the first place, because again your cops are entering this with the intention to like indict people. Your like concrete proof to actually like bring these people to court or whatever. The first thing I want to say here is, irregardless of how particularly you procure these documents or these proof to indict these particular people. Again, it's exactly what I said. The people who are suffering the most are the people at the bottom half of your ladder. I think it's very unlikely that you're like at that point in time, the people, the big fish they intended to caught already have the potential to flee. I don't think this is anything that's going to manifest on this odd case then. But secondly, then I want to say, even if we've already established a framework within society that all these other frameworks to particularly justify why we need to take down organizations are ones that are extremely arduous, that things that are extremely faulty. You have to extract things from the bank, you have to extract things from actors who really don't want their identity being publicized on a wide scale. Then I think that this is where it manifests much better under the alternative that Gov proposes to you, that is still remain like standing within the round here. We tell you that the alternative is firstly that only acting upon firstly and an identifiable kind of like very bad occurrence that has happened within these organizations, or secondly, even if you do identify that those areas have a higher propensity of harm, then this is where you implement rehabilitative measures. I think a lot of this is still standing at the end of the round.
It's been recording this whole time. See you. I think government loses debate is in the moment that they hinge all of their arguments on an inexclusive frame. Because one, they want to push the fact that abuse of power is likely something that means that sting operations cannot happen. They don't explain as to why abuse of power is that something that can only exist or only be proliferated when you have sting operations. If it is true then that these are governments that are actively racist and that police officers actively just want to catch black people, they don't explain as to why the other alternatives that are available to them would not also be abused. Because even if you don't have sting operations and these are, as you say, poor marginalized black people or whatever who do not have legal protections, then it's so easy to abuse them. You're likely happen on your side anyway. Planting evidence, likely then just like actively coercing people to do things can exist. You don't need sting operations for these things to happen. You don't explain then as to why it's likely going to happen in the first place. But secondly, then in terms of the resource allocation, so this is where I think that's a bit like inconsistent, because in late in Vigi he mentions as to why resource allocation is something that's bad, because on our side we're spending so much money on these things when it literally comes at the cost of rehabilitation. He doesn't explain as to why rehabilitation is something that's exclusive. He only does this if it is true then that there is a lot of resources being used instead for these sting operations. If this is true, then this is problematic for the first question I want to answer in this debate, where the instances of use are. So if it is true on your framing then that the cost of these sting operations is so much that you literally cannot afford rehabilitation, then why is it logically true that they're going to do this for poor black people and your lowest petty crimes? If it is true then that it is such a great cost towards the police force, why would they want to put these things in instances that it's very likely not going to be that much of a KPI? Sure, you get one crime arrested, but you don't explain as to why this is justifying the cost of this large thing as opposed to using these sting operations that are very costly and expensive for going for your bigger criminals, for going for places in which you literally have no other incentive. Your own resource allocation argument proves then that it's very likely they're going to be selective in the instances that they choose to do this, and it means that it's likely going to be the most difficult instances where you're going for places that are likely very complicated and the biggest people who have ways in terms of finding legal loopholes and you cannot find or find guilty in the first place. Then I think we just explained to you as to why the likely instances is going to be in these places then. But secondly then, and I think this is also where they concede in whip, because they mentioned that like what's the point of going after these big criminals, because they likely do crimes that are unidentifiable compared to like people who actively recruit people. Yeah, it's true. They are doing unidentifiable crimes, which means then on your side, this is likely, you're not likely going to catch them at all, because these big kingpins like Pablo Escobar and Al Capone are likely doing unidentifiable crimes. How are you going to charge these people on your side of the world? It is only when you have these sting operations where you can identify these crimes in the first place, because you're actively putting spies or people in the ground there to actually see what they're doing then. So you can see then that it's far more difficult for you to ever catch these people through normal or through conventional means on your side, simply because these people are doing crimes that are very difficult for you to discern and very difficult for you to allocate and find in the first place. Then it further justifies the uses that the fact that these are going to be in your most high profile cases then. Second then, in terms of the abuse of power and infringement of rights then. So what do they say then? I think I already tackled this as to why abuse of power is likely something will be symmetrical, but they just try to explain this as to why, oh, you have KPI and that's why you're likely going to do these things then. I don't think they substantiate as to why this can't happen anyway, because if KPI and the rate of catching something is going to happen, you don't explain why it's going to be specifically sting operations. Like, I don't think they're going to put, okay, you have to have a sting operation catch KPI. And if this is true, you don't justify as to why that's likely going to happen in that way, because it's very likely that the people justifying sting operations understand that it's important. So the KPIs probably aren't going to look like things in terms of the number of sting operation arrests you're going to have, but likely going to be one, the scale of people you are catching under these sting operations, like can you uncover one person or like a whole organization? Or secondly, then when you initiate these sting operations, are they likely going to be successful, and what is the successful rate of already happening sting operations? This fundamentally changes things, because it means that when sting operations are initiated, they're going to make every step to ensure that they do it properly. They don't want to risk things like entrapment, because they know then that if these things are found out, they fail their KPI because of the fact that they compromise the sting operation, which further means that they're likely not going to achieve their KPIs. But it doesn't prove why they'll initiate sting operations in the first place, because that's likely not going to be a KPI you put onto police officers. You're going to put a KPI of when these things have been initiated, are they done properly and are they successful? It doesn't mean they're going to do more of them in the first place. But secondly, then in terms of infringement of rights and social contract, I don't think they explain then why social contract particularly applies, because I think to some degree we all sort of give up our rights in terms of security. This is a further extension of that social contract. The only ways in which they can say that this is true is if it breaches that trust, because these are people you're catching who are like innocent in the first place. Therefore, it is a social infringement on their side. But this is true of any sort of abuse of power. Like, we justify imprisonment even though it takes away our rights of freedom, but it's because you are a criminal, you give up this right. So obviously, if you're an innocent person who has been imprisoned, then that is a breach of the social contract and something that cannot happen because you did not do the causes or do the actions that justify this taking away of your rights, which is the same thing for our side then. Like, if these are criminals who are being caught under this sting operation, we are likely going to concede then that these people do not justify the continuation of these rights then, because of the fact that they have given it up by engaging in criminal activity then. Before I move on, yes.
I think you misunderstand the point of our case. On your side, sting operations are much more expensive because you are deeply infiltrating high-level mafias. On our side, it is cheaper to do these things. That's why police will do a mix of both and use our side's case as the KPI indicators.
No, okay. So which is it then? Is it really expensive? Then it leads to outside. But you're saying it's really cheap. Then like this. Then what's the harm? Like, if it's really cheap to do these stupid operations, then they can do that, and then they can also do the really expensive operations. You don't explain as to why they're likely going to focus on this more if it's likely not going to be something different. But secondly, then as to why why the alternatives don't work and why this abuse of power is something that's actually far worse. We just explained to you one as to why there's check and balances in the first place. Like, you have these sort of entrapment rules and all that. And the reasons as to why, the only reason they push that abuse of power happens is because you have like racially charged officers who want to catch black people. But I think Ram and Jason explained to you as to why these are not decisions made by petty officers, but it's rather top down from government incentives, which means that they highly train the people for these things. You're not going to pick some racist guy who has a history of being like arresting black people to want to be in these sting operations. You're likely going to ensure that these people can do their things well and ensure that they're going to likely not have racial biases. And this is proven to be true in the first place. Because the reasons as to why people like Al Capone were caught and all that was because of the fact that these people understood the weight and breadth of their KPIs, and the fact that it's not about how many people you catch, but the overall value of it. Because if it is true then that the mental calculus of an individual policeman is just to catch as many people as possible, then Al Capone would never have been caught, because the instance in which the sting operation suddenly uncovered at least one person doing a crime, they would have just caught that person and stopped it there. But the reasons as to why these people pushed on is because the people that they selected for these operations and the reasoning and the justification for it was to catch these big end criminals that you could not catch in any other instance. That is the case here we're trying to tell you, and we explain to you as to why the people who are likely going to be selected and trained for these things understand these nuances then, and not just going to see the first black person and catch him and then be done with it there. So lastly then, in terms of the success, so I think we explained to you as to why this is the most successful way for you to do it, because the alternatives just cannot manifest in the first place. I think Ram painted you a beautiful picture as to why is things like the corporate wheel that stop people from being able to even do these sorts of things then, because there's so many legal loopholes that are available to your most richest individuals, and these are the people who are likely going to do unidentifiable crimes and likely going to be untouched by the law. It is only through this way in which you can charge these people in the first place. The only way the Gov says is that, oh, suddenly lawyers can say, oh, but you did entrapment and therefore now I can cast doubt on your case. But like, that's what a lawyer does anyway. If you caught this person through traditional means, the lawyer can also come up and say, oh, the evidence was planted, it was not done in the right procedure. These are things that you can also push. We explain to you as to why, at least on our side, then it means that there's an ability for you to put these charges to court in the first place. And it fundamentally shifts on your side when you have these things removed, because then likely then police understand that, okay, now that it's such a long due process, and if I screw it up now, I cannot recharge these people, because if it's thrown out, then I cannot recharge them for the same crime. It means on your side that crimes and these things are likely going to take longer, because policemen understand the weight of failing these sorts of things if you do not allow them the ability to catch them using sting operations. I just want to engage with one idea. The idea that in order to get the sting operations to catch our big guys, which will garner a lot of cost, we first need to show a proof of concept. To do that, we will have small sting operations to catch the small buffaloes, and then we will tell our bosses, aha, we caught the small people in the sting operations. Give me more money, more time for the big sting operations, for the big guns. I just want to address this point because I think that's the strongest thing coming from government team. First things first. If I want to catch Al Capone, my proof of concept cannot be I caught the lowest guy on the ladder 4 times. No one is going to accept this as a proof of concept. And I'm not talking about little children here. I'm talking about the top guns that are determining where money should go when it comes to deciding where to spend on police, especially in the current context where nobody gives a fuck about the pigs. But generally speaking, that is why I don't think it can happen in the way that they are describing. Generally speaking, in our world, sting operations will always exist. The calculus is going to be where am I going to spend the money on? If it is true, I need to show a proof of concept before I get my big sting operation. I will look at history. I will tell you that there's no alternative. What do you want me to do, sir? Do you want me to find a legitimate way to find Al Capone's mistake in his paper trail and then find a case against him on this one piece of paper? Because if you want me to do that, I can try. But that's not going to work. So that is why I need this extrajudicial opportunity, sting operation, in order to capture this man. I think that's enough of me to show proof of concept and to get the sting operation I'm looking for. So it defeats this idea that the only way we can materialize our benefits is to first oppress people who are predisposed to crime and will be catched and will be entrapped and life for them will be difficult. That's not our claim at all. If sometimes in the worst cases, which is what I'm giving to the government team, where sometimes these people caught as stragglers, what to do? Such is life. That is how the criminal justice system works sometimes, even though that should not be the principle of it, but that is the reality of it. Here, you are arguing that because of these realities that exist in all segments of the criminal justice system, we should take one aspect of the criminal justice system and ban it entirely because there's a risk of innocent people getting hurt. Come on, man. That's the entire system. Are you going to ban courts? Are you going to ban rich people from getting lawyers? Are you going to ban prosecutions from going after people who cannot be represented because you don't want to you want to eliminate any risk to innocent people getting punished for something they don't deserve? It can't happen. So in that case, we are willing to buy this trade-off, but they aren't. They are not telling you at all if they are okay with the fact that these big players are going to go away. They still keep trying to mitigate and saying these big players will find a way to escape anyway. Sure, they will give their best attempt. But in our world, it's the only world where we can guarantee some sort of relief against these people. All the greatest criminals that we have caught due to cartels or criminal espionage or anything or major settlements that we have achieved with huge pharmaceutical corporations is always because we have gathered evidence that is incriminating through things like sting operations, through extrajudicial means, through things like whistleblowers that did things that were unethical. These are all things that we have done that are unethical that we allow because of the fact that this is the only way we can catch these people. So that is our argument here, and we're telling you we need this mechanism. I don't think I've heard enough from government to tell me, no, there are other mechanisms, this mechanism cannot happen, and the only reason being that innocent people may get harmed sometimes due to things like KPI, racist police officers, so on and so forth with all the material that they've given you. So I think when you weigh these two material against each other, our impact is clear and straightforward. We want to catch the big people, we want to hurt the worst criminal organizations, and we want to create the highest impact. How can we do this? Can we do this the normal way in which we go through due process and target these people, and how long will that take? We can't. Even if we can, it's not worth it. So we need these thing operations. It already exists in status quo. They needed to tell me why it should be banned. I don't think they've met that burden. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
I think the call out right at the top of my speech is I just want to gut check off. Because there is no way, with a cap sitting in the room, can you run a characterization that sting operations is exclusively for mafias because of all the reasons that they've given and attempt to get away for it. There is no fucking way a cap was like, yeah man, this only applies to mafias who are the worst of the worst as human beings, and we are going to make a gov defend that. Yes, you can veto the motion, but I don't think that caps want to make motions that are as weighted as that in the first place. But even if that is true, I think that the contention that you get from Gov here is a lot fairer. That this applies to both sides. And they say, well, no, you won't do this. But the problem is, if you look at the case that comes from government, I think that our explanation as to why this coexists is very salient. And even when I asked the PI to Mio, there is just no engagement in this, which is, it is fundamentally easier to offer a 50 ringgit bribe to a JPJ officer than it is to infiltrate the deep works of Rosma and Najib and catch them doing something that is illegal. That is something that is fundamentally more expensive than was the thesis of the response in DPM that doesn't get engaged with by Ram and Mio, and that is exactly why it is more expensive on their side. They then say, no response to this, by the way, which is the second call out. Oh, KPIs, yeah, police are idiots who just need KPIs. One, that isn't a response, that is just a dig at the logic. But the second, Azurin explains very clearly as to why police care about KPIs. Because when Azurin explains to you that you really care as police not just about information, but if you fail in the sting operation, catching at the very least the highest level person that you can get, the premise and logic here is that you need to show that you are tough on crime, that you are fighting crime, that you have something to show for. Azurin mentions in her speech that you need something to show for, and this is exactly why the impact of our case materializes, because of the fact that it's fundamentally cheaper and easier to catch these low-level thugs and like criminals on the ground. It shows the perception that the police is tough on crime. If what Ram says in reply is true and people think of police as pigs, this is exactly how they alter this perception in the first place. This is exactly why they would do it. The last call out I have is the response from this team is just immature in terms of why police are bad actors. Because until the end in Mio's speech, they think that it's because of abuses of power and the police is the worst of the worst, a racist piece of shit. One, that is not the point of the case coming from Gov. Gov tells you that the way that you do this is fundamentally curated around ideas that really feel like entrapment and plays on the asymmetry of power. You don't have to be a racist or a bad person to use something that is legal in order to catch someone in the act. But secondly, the principle is independent of the practical consideration. I could be a really good police officer who believes that I'm doing the best for my community right now. That still means that you are violating the principle. That still means that you are breaking the social contract. That still means that all the harms we talk about principally materialize. It isn't enough to say that there's a structural problem and this is symmetric, because this is something that applies regardless of whether or not there's a bias in the round. But crucially, I think that this debate really just boils down to where do sting operations work, and I think that by the end of the debate, both teams, if you want to be mature about this, must agree that some trade-off happens on both sides. I think the more important question is whether it is justified. And Ram says that it is justified because you put one person in jail. But the first response that we give to this is Azurin and I both say, what is the guarantee of you actually catching this criminal? Because I think Op treats this like an absolute. But the weighing here is much more simpler. The absolute of the harm that people experience on our side is much more certain than the absolute of catching or gaining valuable information that is asymmetric to their side. Meaning we can probably get these things. Because the response that we hear from them is, well, you can't follow the paper trail of money. Judge, we give you a myriad of reasons and ways you can intercept these people. You can intercept phone calls. You can follow the trail of where drugs are being smuggled. You can just fucking spy on them the good old way. All of these things are ways that you can get some information. This team needed to weigh the value of the marginal added value in the first place. But at the end of the day, innocent people going to jail is wrong. People asymmetrically being harmed is wrong. And this is not just something that's practically bad, but violates the very principles of statehood.
Thank you, much better. Absolutely. That's the right strategy.
Thanks. Positions, Ovitos. Second veto for Gam. Huh? We both vetoed second.
Both people. No. We voted you because
You posted second.
first, you third.
Yeah.